The restaurant was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel louder. He watched her enter, her crutches tapping softly against the floor, and something in him softened without him even realizing it. She smiled nervously, scanning the room until her eyes met his, and then she whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Please don't laugh at my crutches." That simple plea hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy, and it made his heart tighten in a way he didn't expect. He was a single dad, used to carrying the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but this moment felt different. There was something raw and honest about the way she moved through the world, something that mirrored the quiet strength he had learned to nurture in himself. They sat across from each other, small talk beginning awkwardly, but there was an unspoken understanding forming in the space between them. Every glance, every hesitant smile seemed to carry a story neither of them was ready to tell. As she adjusted her crutches under the table, her eyes flicked to his with a mix of fear and hope. He wanted to reach out, to tell her that her worries were unnecessary, but the words caught in his throat. Something about this first meeting felt pivotal, like the start of a story neither of them knew the ending to. And just as he was about to speak, her phone buzzed, and her face changed, something unreadable crossing her expression. He leaned closer, sensing that whatever was coming next could change everything. Her hand trembled slightly as she checked the message, and he couldn't help but notice. There was a hesitation in her movements, a carefulness that told him she was guarding more than just her words. He wanted to ask, wanted to bridge that invisible wall, but he didn't want to overstep. Instead, he offered a gentle smile, the kind that says, "I'm not going anywhere, and I won't judge you." She had agreed to this date on a whim, encouraged by a friend who insisted she needed to take a chance. But dating had never been easy for her. Every time she tried, the stares, the whispers, the awkward glances at her crutches had made her retreat. Meeting someone new felt like walking a tightrope over a crowd of silent critics. Yet there was something about him, a quiet patience in his eyes, a warmth in his voice, that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, that maybe she could relax. He, too, carried his own history. Being a single dad meant mornings filled with breakfast chaos, school runs, and bedtime stories, but it also meant living with a constant fear of failing someone who depended on him completely. Love had been on hold for years, pushed aside by diapers, deadlines, and responsibilities. Yet sitting across from her, seeing her vulnerability mingled with courage, he felt a spark he hadn't felt in years. Then she looked up from her phone, her eyes searching his, and whispered something that made his stomach twist. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a warning. It was something else entirely, something that hinted at a secret she hadn't shared with anyone. And just like that, the tension in the air grew, heavier and impossible to ignore. Her whisper lingered in his mind long after she had tucked her phone away, and he could feel the weight of it pressing between them. There was something unspoken, a story she wasn't ready to tell, and it made him more curious than he wanted to admit. He wanted to reach out, to ask, but he also knew that some walls couldn't be rushed. Instead, he leaned back slightly, giving her space while silently signaling he was willing to listen whenever she was ready. Meanwhile, she was fighting her own inner battle. She had spent years learning to mask her fears, to smile through awkward stares and hushed comments about her crutches. On the outside, she wanted to appear confident, like her disability was just a part of her, not the defining feature. But inside, every new interaction carried the risk of embarrassment, judgment, or misunderstanding. She wondered if he would see past her crutches, past her careful exterior, to the real person beneath, a woman who longed for connection but feared rejection. On the other side of the table, he was silently wrestling with his own doubts. Being a single dad had taught him patience, but it had also made him cautious. Could he handle the challenges of dating someone with hidden vulnerabilities? Could he balance a budding romance with the responsibilities of fatherhood without losing himself or hurting her? As they shared stories about small, ordinary things, childhood memories, favorite foods, weekend routines, there was a tension underneath the conversation, a sense that both of them were circling around something bigger, something that could either bring them closer or shatter the fragile trust forming between them. And just when the conversation seemed to settle, a waiter arrived with a message slipped into an envelope addressed to her. Her hand froze as she picked it up, and their eyes met with an unspoken question: what could this letter contain, and how would it change everything? Her fingers hovered over the envelope, the paper stiff and unfamiliar under her touch. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to keep the fragile bubble of this evening intact. But curiosity, and something deeper, something she couldn't name, pulled her forward. She tore it open slowly, her eyes scanning the words, and for the first time, she went completely still. He noticed immediately. The casual smile he had been holding vanished, replaced by a quiet, cautious concern. "Is everything okay?" he asked softly, leaning in. But she didn't answer right away. Her lips parted, then closed, as if the words inside the letter were too heavy to speak. The crutches resting beside her suddenly felt heavier, like they were anchoring her to a reality she wasn't ready to face. Across the table, he tried to hide the tightening in his chest. He had felt protective instincts kick in the moment she whispered about her crutches, but now it was more than that. Something about the way she was trembling, the way her eyes darted to the corners of the room as if she expected someone, or something, was watching, made his pulse quicken. He wanted to reach for her hand, but he didn't want to cross a line she hadn't invited him to cross. The room around them seemed to shrink, the soft background chatter fading until all that existed was her, him, and the unreadable message in her hand. She finally looked up, her eyes locking with his in a way that made his stomach twist. I didn't tell anyone about this," she whispered, voice shaking. "Not even my family." The words hung in the air, heavy and urgent, and for the first time that night, he realized that this date, this ordinary evening, had suddenly become anything but ordinary. The waiter cleared a nearby table, and a shadow fell across hers. She glanced up instinctively, and the color drained from her face. He followed her gaze, but all he saw was a figure in the distance, watching. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that whatever she had been keeping secret was not just personal, it was dangerous. Her hand shook as she gripped the envelope, but before she could say another word, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, and the message made her blood run cold. It wasn't from a friend or family member, it was from someone she hadn't heard from in years, someone who had once threatened to turn her life upside down. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, but the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. He leaned closer instinctively, sensing that this was more than just a personal worry. "Who is it?" he asked cautiously, keeping his voice low so no one around them could overhear. She hesitated, and then, in a barely audible whisper, she said, "It's someone I hoped I'd never see again, someone who knows everything about me." The words sent a ripple of unease through him. Up until now, he had been trying to navigate the awkwardness of a first date and the vulnerability of her crutches, but this was a threat that couldn't be ignored. He noticed her eyes darting toward the entrance every few seconds, her posture tense, as if expecting someone to appear out of nowhere. Then it happened. A shadow moved across the window behind her, quick and deliberate. She stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "They're here," she said, voice barely a whisper. His heart pounded. He had come tonight ready for awkward conversations, maybe a few smiles and laughs, but now he was thrust into something far darker, something that put both of them in immediate danger. Her crutches rested beside her, harmless at first glance, but now they seemed almost symbolic, her only tools to stand strong against whatever storm had just arrived. And as the figure approached, slowly but unmistakably, the room seemed to shrink around them, the air charged with fear and anticipation. The single dad realized this date would be remembered forever, not for awkward moments or small talk, but for the secret that had just stormed into their lives and threatened to unravel everything. The shadow stepped into the light, and for a brief moment, she froze, her crutches clattering slightly against the floor. But it wasn't who she expected. The figure was smaller, trembling, and held out a bundle of papers. I found this and thought you should see it," the stranger stammered. Relief and confusion washed over her face, but the tension didn't leave the room.